Studying John 15. We're toward the end of that chapter, so you can be turning there. But before we start this morning, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for another occasion that we have to come together and study your word. We're thankful for all those who have visited this place and are with us this morning. Please be with them, be with all of us, and please help us to take what we have here in the text and become more like your Son. In his name we pray. Amen. Okay, so as I said, we're in John 15, and since we do have quite a few visitors, I wanted to, but I think it's good for even those of us who've been here the whole time, to be reminded of what Jesus has said so far in these farewell discourses. Notice it's plural. And I think that may be because we have more than one farewell discourse here, but that's not really terribly important. So first and foremost, what Jesus is doing, you see this clearly at the beginning of John 14, is that Jesus wants to prepare his disciples for his death. And one of the things that I've emphasized, and we really talked about this, I think it was last time, and we'll talk about it again today, is that Jesus is a friend of theirs. It's not just disciple and student relation. It's not just master and Lord relation. He's a friend, and he was a friend to them in a unique way. We would say that we are friends of God, right? But it's not the same because we didn't walk with Jesus. So we can never have that level of intimacy, at least in this life, that they had. Right? So there's a clear distinction to be made. We talked about how then he tells them he's going to prepare a place for them, and they can't follow him just yet. And then Jesus, of course, makes the claim that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And then what we spent a good part of our time talking about last class is that he promises his disciples that he will send the advocate, and he will fill the void, basically. And he's going to help them, right? When Jesus leaves them, he wants to say, or he wants them to be assured, he's not leaving them alone. That's why he says, I will not leave you orphaned, right? So he won't leave them alone in the form of the advocate. And again, we'll see another passage or two where Jesus mentions that idea. We looked at all of them together. And so here we have them again. All right, so there was one thing, I think we mentioned this last time from John 15, that I would really like to talk more about. All right, so verse 26, he says, the advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything, remind you all of I've said to you. And then he says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Right? So this fits in with what he says at the very end of this verse. Do not let your heart be troubled and do not let them be afraid. Remember, he began the discourse by saying, do not let your heart be troubled, which, if we ask the question, why would Jesus say that? Because their hearts would be troubled, and he knew that, right? Because of the situation. But the phrase that he says in between those two statements about peace he's giving them and the fact that he doesn't want their heart to be troubled. He says, I do not give it to you as the world gives. I do not give peace as the world gives. I think it's worth asking, what does that mean? How does the world give peace? Does anybody have any idea? I know that's not maybe the easiest question with which to begin, but does anybody know what he means there? Yeah. Okay.
So like maybe the world thinks of like external things, like it looks peaceful, but Jesus is giving peace to the heart. Like
okay.
Do not let your hearts be troubled. So Jesus' type of peace is more like he's asleep in the boat while the storm is happening, rather than it's perfectly still water.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. And so I think that that might be it. The peace that the world can give. I mean, let's think about what sort of peace would that involve? Think about in the Roman Empire, which of course is very much relevant. What sort of peace would they have? Well, they would have political peace. There would be no fighting. There would be no conflict. And again, we think about it in the Palestinian context. There's no conflict between the Jews and the Romans. That would be peace, right? So it is, I guess we could say it's qualitative because Jesus' peace transcends any of that, right? Yeah.
I think also the notion of relationship. The peace with Jesus really is a very right relationship with him.
Right.
Harmony. And you're going to be either in harmony with him or in harmony with the world.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point that we're going to see is this later on, this conflict with the world and with the disciples. So yeah, I think that's certainly in the background given the context. Anything else about this peace that the world gives? And the peace the world gives can have something to do with the relationship. Maybe, like you said, maybe externally everything looks great, right? But internally, maybe it's not. I think about, maybe I shouldn't bring this up, but why not? The notion of social media, right? Social media profiles. What do we want to reflect in our social media profiles? Well, everything's great. I mean, again, most people, some people really do bare their souls. They're honest about it. But other people don't. A lot of people want to give this fiction that everything's okay. And that can create anxiety. There have been studies done about the anxiety that creates, particularly in teenagers, when they see their friends and everything's perfect and they look at their own lives and they think, my life's not like that. Why is that? Right? Well, it's a fiction. Okay? It's a persona. So that appears to be peaceful, like Ross was saying, I think, externally, but it's really not. So the peace that Jesus gives, as I said, transcends any of that and transcends the notion that peace, transcends the notion that peace has with us typically, right? It's more than that. Okay, so anything else about that? All right, so he says, you've heard me say, I'm going away and I'm coming to you. If you loved me, you would rejoice that I'm going to the Father, because the Father is greater than I. And now I've told you this before it occurs, so that when it does occur, you may believe. I will no longer talk much with you, for the ruler of the world is coming. He has no power over me. But I do as the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. Let us be on our way. Remember, for those who've been here, I've mentioned that verse 31 might be a seam from chapter 15. What that means is this could signal that what we have after this is the beginning of another discourse. Again, we don't have to go into any of that. But clearly there's a break here between what he says, what he's going to say, even though contextually a lot of it fits pretty well together. Okay, so he says the ruler of this world is coming. Well, who's the ruler of the world? It's Satan, right? Which is perhaps a surprising thing to say, because who's the real ruler of the world? That's God, of course, right? So in what sense then, and as many of you know surely, this isn't the only place where Satan is referred to as the ruler of the world. In what sense is he the ruler of the world? And that maybe there are several ways to take that, but in what sense can we say this is true? Yeah.
Well, Jesus is about to die.
Yep.
And so there will be that temporary situation where he has passed away, he's in the grave.
Yeah, right. And I think that indicates the rule of the world is coming, right? It's not the idea that, well, the ruler of the world isn't present. He has no power over people of the world. That's not the point. The point is he's going to do what he wants to do, at least in this instance. And I think you're right. It has to do with the death of Jesus. Yeah, Aaron. Yeah, ultimately he's not. Exactly. But he's a ruler because of what? Is it the power that he exerts, or is it the power that people let him exert? Right? And I think maybe that's the way to look at it. So again, and this is something that is I think we could admit it's almost cliche, but it's true. And it's the idea of, well, which ruler of the world are we going to allow to influence us? That's the question, right? That's the really practical question. And that's what's so interesting. He says the ruler of the world's coming. He's going to do this, but ultimately, he doesn't have power over me. Does he have power over us ultimately? If we allow it. But if we don't, no. Ultimately, he can't. Okay, we may die, which is a product of what he wants, right? But that's not the end. And that's, of course, where the power of Jesus comes in. Anything else about that phrase? Okay, I thought I saw a hand, but I'm seeing things, I guess. All right, so chapter 15. And this is what I say, the transition here, he says, let us go on our way, and then he keeps talking. So some people say, well, is he saying this like while they're walking? I don't know. And again, the text doesn't tell us. I don't think it's terribly important how we fit this into the actual narrative. I don't consider that to be terribly important. But anyway, what is important, of course, is what he actually says. And he says, I'm the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. Obviously, if he's talking about the vine, he's talking about those plants in Israel that were very common, of course. And so the other question, though, is what is the background of this imagery? And here we can say some things, but everything we can come up with really doesn't quite match what Jesus is doing here. There's possible allusions to ideas that he's mentioning here. But ultimately, as we read John, we know how John works by now, that when he uses symbols, when he uses images, there's more to it than meets the eye a lot of times. And we have to dig a little bit to figure out what it is. Here, even with our digging, it's hard to say exactly what the background is. There have been all kinds of speculation, but ultimately I don't think we can know. But as you may be aware, there's plenty of vineyard imagery, as we have here in Isaiah chapter 5. And of course, this is cited by Jesus himself a little bit later. But let's read this passage and see if this might have anything to do with what Jesus is talking about. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it, he cleared it, he planted it with choice vines, built a watchtower, hewed out a wine vat. He expected it to yield grapes, but yielded wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard than I have not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I'll tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be devoured. I will break down its wall. It will be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, and it will be overgrown with briars and thorns. I also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. And then he tells us what the vineyard is. This is an allegory, right? Because he says the vineyard of Yahweh of hosts is the house of Israel. And the people of Judah, his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but a cry, right? So here we see there's no guessing what this is. And there are several similarities with Isaiah 5 and what we read in John 16. Israel is the vineyard, and what's the problem? They don't bear fruit, or they don't bear the right fruit. They're supposed to yield grapes that can be used. Instead, they yield fruit that just can't be used. That's the idea. You say wild grapes, well, what's wrong with that? Well, they're not useful, and that's the point. Okay. He says it will not be pruned. Well, that's the language used in John 16. So, what does this tell us? The vineyard or the vines that Jesus, or the branches of the vine that Jesus is talking about in John 16 can't be Israel. Because here, Israel is going to be destroyed. In John 16, The branches will be taken care of with the intent that they will bear the correct fruit. And they at least have that potential. Here, I don't see any potential right now. Of course, he does say, those that lack potential, they'll be burned up. So that's part of this as well. So, okay, we can see that the parallels there somewhat, but ultimately, it's not quite close enough. Well, I think we have to say the same thing about this next passage. This is from a book that's classified in the Jewish pseudepigrapha. This is 2nd Baruch. This is the Baruch that's Jeremiah's scribe. It's not really him. It's a later text. Probably 1st century, maybe 2nd century AD. So perhaps it's a little late for us, but it's close in time period. And this is one of those cases where you may say, well, why are we bothering to read a text like this? Well, it's because it may give us a hint as to what Jesus is getting at. And again, may is the correct word. It's tempting, but again, I'm not so sure it's close enough. This is an apocalyptic text. This is an apocalyptic vision. He says, when I said these things, I fell asleep there, and I saw a vision in the night. And behold, a forest of trees planted on the plain, and lofty and rugged mountains around it, rocky mountains. And then the forest occupied much space. And behold, over against it arose a vine. There we go. From under it there went forth a fountain peacefully. And it will come to pass when the time of its consummation that it shall fall has approached, then the principate of my Messiah will be revealed, which is like the fountain and the vine. And when it is revealed, I will root out the multitude of its host. And then we see basically the rest of it has this idea that the vine speaks. And the vine basically tells this tree, this forest, that it's going to be destroyed. The forest represents this foreign kingdom, and the tree represents the leader. So there's a tempting parallel there, because you might say, well, this leader, is this the ruler of the world? Which contextually is close. The problem here, though, is it's not just the vine. If it was just the vine, then the vine equals the Messiah, I think we got a really good parallel. But it also says the fountain. Jesus doesn't, of course, mention anything like that. So again, we can see somewhat of a parallel, but on the other hand, maybe it's not quite so clear as we would want for a legitimate parallel. So that we could say, okay, when John's first readers or Jesus' first hearers heard or read this, they would say, that's a messianic symbol. Maybe it is, but that's as far as we can go. Another passage wherein we don't have the chronological problem, it's earlier, and this is in the Apocrypha. This is Sirach, this is Ben Sira, it's called by a few different names. But this is talking about wisdom personified. Wisdom becomes, in Second Temple literature, this, and we talked about this very early on, but wisdom becomes this almost, how should I say this? Metaphysical being, almost. I don't know if I would say definitely. But it's almost like it has a special significance which is beyond a personification. But at the very least, we can say it's a personification. Wisdom praises herself and tells of her glory in the midst of her people. Like the vine, I bud forth delights, and my blossoms become glorious and abundant fruit. Come to me, you who desire me, and eat your fill of my fruits. For the memory of me is sweeter than honey, possession of me sweeter than the honeycomb. Those who eat of me will hunger for more, and those who drink of me will thirst for more. Okay, so again, I think this one is not nearly as close as I would like it. Jesus being identified with wisdom, as in this passage, but it's also in the biblical canon. It's in Proverbs 8. That's possible that Jesus would be connected to that. I think it's clear in other passages, but maybe not here. Again, these are just possibilities. So to summarize these non-biblical texts, it could be a messianic symbol, It could be saying that Jesus is the Messiah in the sense he's the vine. He's saying, I'm the vine, I'm the Messiah. He could be saying, I'm also to be identified with wisdom personified, but maybe not. Okay. So it's possible. And I say that to say, ultimately, scholars have come up with different explanations, but there's no consensus, right, as to exactly what's behind the use of the vine. Well, more important than that, again, is what he actually says. And he says, he removes every branch in me that bears no fruit, he being God. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You've already been cleansed or pruned by the word that I have spoken to you. All right, so we'll look at the rest of this here in a minute, where he talks about abiding. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Okay, so this is similar to Isaiah 5, where if you don't bear fruit, you can't be in this. Okay, as many of us know, also bearing fruit is a very common way to talk about this metaphor. What does it mean to bear fruit, though? Anybody know? Yeah. Yeah.
Would there be any application to what we call personal evangelism? You know, the Great Commission, go, teach, make disciples, baptize them, and then you teach them to do what I told you to do. And we bear fruit as we teach others.
Yep.
I think there may be an application there for that.
Absolutely. That's absolutely at least part of it, right? So yeah, one way to bear fruit, teach others. What's another way to do it? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right. Keeping his commandments, which in the context he's already talked about. So we know that's part of it, which includes teaching others. Yeah.
And I think like a fruit of following his commandments is the fruit of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Attributes that are like God.
Yeah, exactly. And when you mention the fruit of the Spirit, which I figured somebody might, because for many of us maybe that's the first thing we think about here. Okay, so yes, this is doing things for other people. But isn't it also something that we can see in our relationships with people with whom we interact every day, right? Can we bear fruit in those ways? Maybe that's not typically the first way we think about it, but isn't that bearing fruit? Isn't that showing the love of Jesus with people with whom we deal regularly? Right? And I don't know if I'm going to say too much here, but sometimes at least it's a lot easier to be nice to people in a setting like this than it is to be nice to people with whom you live, right? I mean, I hope I'm not alone in that. I really hope I just haven't told you my inner thoughts and you think, man, who is this person? So I feel better about it. But that's, for me though, that's where things like bearing fruit become eminently practical. I mean, and that's not to say the other ways that I've mentioned aren't practical. They are, but this is something that every day I have to think about. I have to try to do. Yeah.
Well, what the fruit of the Spirit that's being described in Galatians 5 is about is our character.
Yeah.
That's the thing it's describing there.
Yep.
And the Christian character is that power for good, that influence in the world.
Yep.
That then, as Brother Tam said, helps bring people.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. The character is a huge part of that as well. And like you said, that's what Galatians 5 is about, is essentially character, which isn't something that just shows up sometimes, right? It shows up when we interact with people, but it also shows up when people aren't around as well. And we could certainly talk about that comment. So he says, every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. So how do we bear more fruit? Well, I mean, let me back up a minute. Is there anybody in here who could say, I've borne enough fruit, I don't really have to be pruned anymore, I'm good, I've done that? Okay, me either. So I feel better about that too. So how are we pruned here? And let me be. One of the problems with the final discourses here is that he is talking primarily to his disciples that are with him. And I don't think we need to forget that, because some of the things he says, if we try to apply it directly to us, is difficult. So let's not forget that. But there are occasions where we can see application, like here. Okay, so in other words, I don't think we would say, well, Jesus only prunes his immediate disciples. He doesn't really do that anymore. I don't think we would say that. So how does he prune disciples? How us to bear more fruit? How does that? Does anybody have an insight as to how that process happens? Yeah.
I think the picture further on that talks about abiding.
Yep.
I think the notion is the change that occurs because of that abiding. It says focusing on His Word, listening to it, changing our lives and becoming more and more like Him.
Yep.
To me, the fruit bearing is just like the loving God and loving our fellow man. They're tied together. You can't separate one from the other.
Yeah. Right.
And when we do live as we are, become more like Christ. Our relationships with others is much more what they're supposed to be. Our character reflects who Jesus is in those relationships.
Yep, right. So the more we abide in Him, the more we get to know Him, the better all that's going to be, and the more fruit we're going to bear. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Okay, so he says again, verse 5, I'm the vine, you're the branches, those who abide in me, and I and them bear much fruit, like he was just saying. Because apart from me, you can do nothing. He doesn't say, apart from me, you can do some things. He says, you can do nothing. What does that mean? Does that mean we can't, and let's again think about the metaphor of fruit bearing. Does that mean we can't do good stuff without Him? Is that what he's saying? That can't be it. So what does he mean? You can do nothing without me or apart from me. Yeah. No, that's all right. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. And is that because you can't do good things? No, it doesn't mean that. But it's the purpose, it's the motivation behind them. What were you going to say?
I was thinking of the same idea. I mean, you imagine cutting off a branch from it, because it's separate from the vine itself.
Yeah. Right. Right, exactly. And again, it has to do with it's not from the correct source. So, okay, you may do good things from the perspective of people around you, but it's not the same because you're not abiding in the vine again, all right? So whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. And I think we can figure that out. Anything else about this metaphor that somebody would like to add? Yeah.
Just kind of thinking about this and the point that you made that, he's talking to his disciples, but a few of us have been going through a study of 2 Corinthians.
Mm-hmm.
Paul states this, we were talking about this last week, about being ambassadors of Christ.
Yeah.
We see this vine imagery of, this is how you know that you're my disciples, it's by the fruit that you bear. And in 2 Corinthians 6, I'll show you, it says, but as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, by great endurance in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, the Holy Spirit, and genuine love, by truthful speech and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, through honor and dishonor, through slander and praise, we are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying, and behold we live, as punished and yet are not killed, as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing, but possessing everything. I just think it kind of, wraps that whole idea up.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Very good parallel. Man, 2 Corinthians, so underrated. But anyway. Yeah, that's absolutely good parallel. And speaking of persecution, that's what he's going to say in the very next chapter. He's going to mention specific persecution that I think is applicable to those who are hearing Jesus speak then, but I think it's also applicable to those who are reading the text. And remember, we have to realize that I would say at least three different audiences: those to whom Jesus is speaking, his immediate disciples, but also the original recipients of the gospel, the text itself, and then of course us. And so we have to keep that in mind. But anyway, so yes, abiding certainly includes abiding in difficult circumstances, like Paul was talking about in the passage that you read. All right, so he says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servant any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I've called you friends, because I've made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you. And I appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I'm giving you these commands so that you may love one another." Oh, so much here. But notice 14 and 15. There's a change in maybe the status of the disciples. It's not just, and by the way, when he says, "I do not call you servant," I don't think he means, okay, you're not my servant anymore, we're equals. I don't think that's what he means. But he's saying that's not predominantly how you're going to be known. You're friends. You're my friends, right? And he says, "I'm going to lay down my life for you." And then and we'll talk more about this concept of friendship in just a second. But he says in verse 16, "You did not choose me, but I chose you." What does that mean? And remember the different levels that I just mentioned in which we have to read it. To his immediate disciples, he says, "I chose you. You didn't choose me." What is that? What is he talking about? Okay, it could be that. He chose them as students. Although, of course, you do have examples where students seek out a particular teacher. Okay, but it could mean that, yeah.
He's just letting them know the nature of his, you have people that may gravitate toward you.
Yeah.
Don't particularly want to be, in your circle of friends, and then there's people that you choose, that you want to have that relationship with. They may desire a relationship with you, you don't desire a relationship with them. But in this instance, I want this
Yeah.
relationship with you. I've chosen you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're coming after me, and we may or may not, have a relationship with one of us. I've chosen you, and I want this relationship.
Yeah, right. Which is interesting because you said you may have people following after you. You don't necessarily want them as part of your friend group. Remember how Jesus chose disciples in the Gospel of John. He had people following him. Now, did Jesus choose them? How does that work? Yeah, what were you going to say?
Also in 1 John 4:10, it says, that he loved us before we loved
Yep.
him. And so we were separated and chose to be separate from him, but he chose to love us anyways and
Yep.
follow after us.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But again, Steve, yeah.
Could it not be the context that we're speaking to here that he's talking about him choosing them as his apostles?
Yeah, I think so.
And
Yeah.
that goes on to talk about then, that he would work specifically with them, that he would give them in the Father's name what they ask for.
Yeah.
Maybe that's referring specifically.
I think so. I think it is. He's talking about how he chose his disciples. Again, though, that's interesting in John because he's got disciples following after him. It looks like they're choosing him, but he actually chose them. Yeah.
There was that one period, where he did have a lot of disciples, but then when he started talking about, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood.
Yeah, right.
His teaching is too hard, and a lot of them just left, and it was the ones that he chose.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's not the only point where Jesus says something and some potential disciples, I guess you could say, would be like, well, I've had enough. I can't follow somebody who says that, right? So there is this sense in which he chose those initial disciples. Here's the question, though. Is there a sense in which he chose, we say again, the first readers of the text, but more practically, did he choose us? Did he choose you? Did he choose me? Now, there are different ways to understand that, of course. But is there a sense in which he chose us? Yeah. Ephesians 1, he chose us before the foundation of the world. He predestined us to adoption as sons. Okay, so how does that work, though? Does it mean that he chose me out of all other people? All right, I want that guy to be my disciple. No, it doesn't mean that, right? He chose a certain kind of person that would come to be his disciple. I think that's at least one way to understand it. Yeah.
When you said that called something to mind with them where Jesus said, many are called, but few are chosen.
Right, good. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
In the Great Commission, Jesus said, go make disciples. That's pretty much what he's saying right here. He appointed us to go make disciples, but that's contingent upon us choosing him.
Yeah, right. Right.
And obeying him.
Yeah, right, exactly. So he says, I appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last, which I think is another phrase we could spend some time on. Well, why don't we? What does that mean? Fruit that will last. So, to me, this indicates, okay, somebody could bear fruit. And they could bear fruit for the right reason, but it's not going to last. On the other hand, somebody could bear fruit and it's lasting fruit. What do you think that means? Yeah.
So they said with the faith, hope, and love, by these three, maybe that would be some.
Okay.
You know, love is the fruit that lasts.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So love is the one that's going to be around forever, right? Essentially, yeah, it could mean that, yeah.
About what Jesus is telling his close disciples that they're going to do. You're going to go out, you're going to preach the gospel and create, my children. And that's what's going to last, those heavenly relationships.
Yeah.
That you're going to teach people about me and they're going to be my followers.
Right. And I think sometimes, this is going to sound maybe wrong, but I think sometimes maybe we if we're doing the right thing, we think, okay, I'm doing the right thing. That's enough, right? But are there times where we have to make decisions on whether to do the right thing or whether to do the better thing? And the better thing may be the fruit that lasts, right? I don't want to push too much. I don't want to overread it, but perhaps that is an application of what he's saying. Ultimately, though, verse 17, I'm giving you these commands so that you may love one another. And we talked about this in a previous class, that it's so telling how many times in the New Testament where the text says to love each other, and it's talking to Christians to love each other. Why is that there so many times? Well, it's because we're imperfect. And it's also because, think about the preacher that used to preach where we went years ago. He would always say, there are so many different, everybody has their own story here. And I think what that does is that speaks to the diversity of people that meet here. Think about all the differences of people in this room right now. Are we going to agree about everything? No. We probably talk long enough, we'll come up with some sort of disagreement. That's why I think it's all over the place in the New Testament that you love each other, because it's not so easy when we are dealing with people that think about some important things differently than we do. And the reason, though, that we ought to love each other is, of course, because whatever the differences are, our commonality in Jesus transcends all that, right? And I think that's why it's, again, all over the place in the New Testament. Okay, so let's say something about friendship in the Greco-Roman world. This is one of those things where we just assume, well, this is I mean, a friend is a friend, right? But even in how we use the terminology, now in English we can see differences, right? For example, Facebook, friends. Now, are those real friends? Some of us say no. Some of us might say, yeah, they are. See, we're disagreeing about that. No, we have different notions of friendship even in our society. You might call a person a friend that you talk to occasionally. I may just say, well, that's an acquaintance. It's not really a friend. A friend is somebody that you're really close to, right? See, there's differentiation even for us in English. So in the Greco-Roman world, it's something that people discussed a lot. For example, Aristotle, I needed to mention him because I mention him quite often for those of you who aren't here. But Aristotle in his book on ethics, the main book on ethics, he spends 2 books talking about friendship. This is a really important topic in ancient sources. And we should note, and I bring this up because this might be a possibility with regard to Jesus and his disciples, it's not always a relationship among equals. Remember, you've got this patron-client relationship that's so common in the Greco-Roman world, and you could say as a client that your patron is your friend. Does that mean you're equals? No, you're not equals. But he still could be considered your friend. So it could have that connotation, but as it does in our society, it contains ideas of loyalty and sharing and intimacy. The quickest way to break up a friendship, disloyalty, right? So we have that idea, of course, in our concept of friendship. So, okay, I don't know how much this adds necessarily because it is similar to our notion, but maybe the second point is worth considering because, yes, Jesus says, I'm not calling you a slave any longer, but a friend. But like I said, it's not like he's saying we're completely equal now, right? There's no hierarchy between me and you. I certainly don't think that's what Jesus is saying there. Okay, so somebody mentioned this earlier, this conflict with the world. Well, here it is in the text. If the world hates you, be aware that it hated me before it hated you. If you belong to the world would love you as its own because you do not belong to the world, but I've chosen you out of the world. Therefore, the world hates you. Why would the world hate, and again, let's stick to the immediate context, why would the world hate Jesus' disciples? Yeah.
Because they tell them their ways are wrong. The world doesn't have to be told their ways are wrong.
Yeah, exactly. People don't like to hear that, right? And remember, and let's be more specific. Who's the world that Jesus is talking about specifically? I mean, for example, at this point in history, do you think people in India know who Jesus is and who his disciples are? No. No knowledge of it as far as we know. Eventually, of course, they do, but at this point, no knowledge. So who would the world be then? Yeah.
I take the world to mean like the people that are comfortable with living in sin. I mean, still at this time we have sexual immorality going on, cheating, lying, stealing, and to an extent that it's actually normalcy, it's natural, it's encouraged, and that's what I see.
Yeah.
As the world.
Yeah, right. And that certainly is an application. Here, though, I think it's probably talking about the Jews who may not necessarily be engaged in that kind of behavior, but, and I would say the Jews, the Jewish leaders in particular, who opposed Jesus. Well, guess what? In the book of Acts, they opposed the disciples, right? So that is a very clear application of exactly what Jesus is saying here. They hated me, they're going to hate you. But now, back to your point, is there a sense in which the world could hate us too? And again, we have to be careful. Not necessarily everything he says has direct application to us, but is there a sense in which the world could hate us? How so? And let me say this. I don't, maybe disagree. That's okay. But I don't think now, at least, that the world necessarily hates Christians generally. Oh, yeah, some people do. Some groups do. No doubt about it. But I think now it's more indifferent. And I think we'll see that progress. There's more indifference with regard to Christianity. And as far as the influence of Christianity continues to diminish, which at least in my view it seems like that's the case, I think people are going to become even more indifferent. That doesn't mean people aren't going to hate us. But last thing, because they're storming at the gates. In what sense does the world hate us? Maybe because again, there are people in the world who would be vehemently opposed to Christianity. Why is that? Yeah.
At some point, you're going to live or say or do something
Yep.
in contradiction to what they believe to hold true.
Yep.
And they're going to attack you because of it.
That's it. I think that's the right answer, simple answer. That's a good way to end. Thank you for your comments.